Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. My name is Tanya and my colleague Scott and I will be your co-hosts for tonight's virtual book launch, Marilla Before Anne with Louise Michalos. The format of tonight's program will be as follows. I will introduce Kate Watson, one of tonight's guests, and Kate will introduce Louise Michalos and Jane Doucet. The evening will include a reading from the book and an interview with Louise by Jane. Once the interview is over, we'll follow up with questions from the audience. We wish to begin tonight's program by acknowledging that we are on Mi'kmaq. We live, work, and play on ancestral land that belongs to the Mi'kmaq people, the First Peoples of Nova Scotia. As we seek to build a more inclusive municipality, we remember that we are all treaty people and that those of us who are non-Indigenous each have an individual responsibility to acknowledge and address the centuries of injustice, suffering, and broken promises that resulted from the European settlement. We are pleased to be a part of tonight's book launch, Marilla Before Anne with Louise Michalos. Tonight's book launch is in partnership with Nimbus Publishing. Please join me in welcoming Kate Watson, Atlantic publicist from Nimbus Publishing and Vagrant Press, to introduce tonight's guests.
Good evening. I know we wish we could all be together, but before this, we were just talking about how wonderful it is that an event like this can happen and be seen all across Canada, all across the world. So we welcome you here tonight for the launch of Marilla Before Anne. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Nimbus, and I'd also like to express our thanks to the Canada Council for the Arts and the Province of Nova Scotia. The support from these two great organizations has allowed us to continue publishing important and entertaining books like Marilla Before Anne, even in these difficult times. I also want to thank Whitney Moran, managing editor at Nimbus, and also the editor of Marilla Before Anne, for her discerning eye, as well as the book's designer, the talented Jen Embry. Also, thanks to all the wonderful authors who took the time to read and provide advanced praise for Marilla Before Anne: Genevieve Graham, Carrie Clare, Liz Rosenberg, Leslie Crew, and Linda Little. So now, a little about the book. Marilla Cuthbert was 52 years old when the plucky redheaded Anne Shirley came to live with her and her brother Matthew at Green Gables farm on Prince Edward Island. A seemingly cold and dour spinster, her heart eventually softens to the lovable orphan girl. But for over a century, readers have wondered, who was Marilla Before Anne? In Louise Michalos' remarkable debut novel, readers are introduced to a spirited 18-year-old Marilla Cuthbert, a girl not unlike Anne herself, who is desperately in love and whose whole life is spread before her. But when a moment of defiance brings life-changing consequences, a new Marilla begins to take shape, one who would learn to bear tragedy like a birthright and loss as an inevitability, and who would hold steadfast to the secrets that could shatter the lives of everyone around her. Weaving its way from Marilla's early life in Avonlea to her coming of age in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and back, Marilla Before Anne is the story readers of Anne of Green Gables have longed for. Told with a refreshingly original East Coast voice, this exquisite, heartbreaking work of historical fiction takes readers on a journey back in time to Green Gables, where Marilla Cuthbert lived, loved, and learned long before Anne. So I'm going to start by introducing Jane Doucet, who is going to introduce our author of the evening, Louise. Jane Doucet is a journalist whose articles have appeared in a myriad of national magazines, including Chatelaine and Canadian Living. In 2017, she self-published her debut novel, The Pregnant Pause, which was shortlisted for a 2018 Whistler Independent Book Award. Jane lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia with her husband. She is working on her third novel, which will combine characters and storylines from her first two books. And what's missing in that is her second book is called Fishnets and Fantasies, and there will be a book launch for that next Tuesday evening. Yeah. But now to Louise. Born on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia and raised in Halifax, Louise brings an authentic voice to Marilla Cuthbert's story. The second youngest of a family of 9, Louise's life was infused with stories of love, loss, and family secrets that are held within small communities throughout Atlantic Canada. After a 40-year career in retail banking, human resources, and program administration with the provincial government, what started as a great retirement hobby turned into a published novel, and we're glad it did. So now I'll turn the evening over to Louise.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Thank you so much. Nice to see you, Jane. So everybody, before I get started, I'm going to do 3 readings tonight. But before I start, I just have to say hello to everybody out there in Zoom land. I wish I could say it's lovely to see your faces, but I can't see them. But I do want to give a special shout out to my grandson, Jack Scallion from Baker Creek, BC, who is right now with his dad, my son, Sean Scallion. Just want to say a special hi from Nanny, anyway. And everybody else, yeah, just wonderful to see the names up in the queue. Behind me is some flowers from Tree Fawn for the occasion and my big Marilla book. Now I'm going to read 3 passages, 3 short ones from 3 different sections. So I'm going to read the very opening, the first chapter, because I think that's always good to get sort of a beginning of the story. So I'll start there. The first part's called Into the Abyss, Chapter 1. Saturday, August the 7th, 1841, Avonlea, Prince Edward Island. The warm August breeze ruffled Marilla's hair as she climbed onto the roof of the back porch. Her crinoline rustled beneath her dress, breaking the stillness of the night as she dropped to the ground to make her escape. Imagine having to escape your own home. She tried it once when she was 7 years old, and even now, 10 years later, the sting of her mother's slap was sharp in her memory. But Marilla knew if she didn't brave this one act of defiance against her parents, she would simply die. The full moon lit her way as she tiptoed across the yard, praying her parents wouldn't hear her. She lifted her petticoat and started to run. A giggle, long buried, broke free and filled her with what she always known was missing from her life, that which she was now running toward, and the one thing that didn't exist in the house behind her, joy. Pure, life-sustaining joy. As far as Marilla was concerned, it had been choked to death a long time ago by her mother's piousness, superiority, and self-righteousness. Tonight, Marilla would risk her punishment and the wrath of God Almighty himself just to have William hold her. She hoped and prayed this one night would change all the others to come. She ran toward Rachel and the flickering lantern that waited for her at the end of the lane, and together they raced toward town, where the dance hall was already aglow with lights, where the sound of laughter filled the air, where the face of the man she'd fallen more in love with every day since they met would smile just for her. William leaned against the door jamb. His jacket, the only one he owned, felt tight across his shoulders. He'd labored long these past months, and his muscles had broadened across his back. And though he was more comfortable in work clothes, he wanted Marilla to see that he could present himself as well as any other man, or at least as well as John Blythe. He stood taller than John ever would, but he'd learned that privilege and status in a community as small as Avonlea brought its own form of stature to a man. The last of the sun had slipped below the trees, and the peepers began their rhythmic symphony. William sighed, his impatience at last getting the best of him. She'll get here, don't worry. Who? What are you talking about? The snort of laughter from behind and the clap of Duncan's hand on his shoulder made him turn. Willie, my man, there's no hiding it. A blind man could see what you so stubbornly won't. And you can mark my words, that little filly who caught your eye when we landed here back in June is at this moment braving life, limb, and most likely mortal soul to get here. William swatted the hand from his shoulder and smirked. He jumped, leaving the steps behind, and landed in the dooryard, releasing the excitement that exploded at the mention of Marilla's limbs. Duncan headed back inside, leaving William to stare down the darkened road, his words drifting behind him as he retreated. I'd be careful, William. John Blythe won't take kindly to a mainlander stealing his girl. The lantern held between the two young women shook as Rachel's words hissed into the darkness. You can't possibly love him, Marilla. Get hold of yourself. You've only known him a few months. What in the name of God will your mother say? She'll not have it. Marilla looked into Rachel's eyes, made all the more fiery by the glow of flame between them, and spat words she'd had little practice using. I don't care. With that, she grabbed the lantern and started walking away. You don't care? Why, Marilla Cuthbert, Rachel said, racing to catch up. In all my life, I have never heard words like that coming from you. You, who has cared for everything and for everyone for, well, forever. Precisely. But what about John? Are you saying you don't have feelings for him? Everyone knows you're his girl, Marilla. Always have been, always will be. Marilla's rigid stance stopped Rachel in her tracks. I am not his girl. Just because everyone thinks it doesn't make it so. John, with skin that's never seen a hard day's work in the sun and hair the color of straw. He pales next to my William. I'm certainly fond of him. We've known each other for years. And I guess I thought maybe that's what love was. But Rachel, I didn't even know what love was until I met William. Now I do. Rachel's voice softened. William is quite handsome. Anyone can see that. Marilla placed a hand over her forehead and feigned a swoon, which made Rachel giggle. But you haven't looked into his eyes. They are the deepest brown with bits of amber that sparkle when he smiles. And his teeth, they're perfect. Oh, for heaven's sakes, Marilla, he's not a horse. And he's sweet and thoughtful and so strong. Marilla, anxious now and breathless at the thought of seeing him, looped her arm through Rachel's, and best of all, he loves me too. The sound of fiddles reached them, and the glow of light shining in the distance made them squeal with excitement as they ran together toward the dance hall. So that's the first part. The second section I'm going to read is from chapter 23. It takes place, okay. This is one where Marilla's heading back to Halifax, back to Prince Edward Island from Halifax. The drizzle soon turned to showers, and Marilla, struggling against the wind, pulled open the hatch and rushed inside. She found her way to her tiny overnight cabin down a narrow hall and placed her baggage in the overhead rack. So like a train, she thought, except for the lap of waves against the hull. She shrugged out of her wet coat and was just placing it on a peg behind the door when it suddenly opened, and the large backside of an elderly man, bent gathering his bags, pushed its way through. He grunted as he tugged them over the threshold, and when he stood, closing the door with his foot, Marilla, startled by the intrusion, fell against the bunks, and he, wet and windblown, fell against the door. My dear good woman, what in the name of heavens are you doing here? This is my cabin, sir. The more appropriate question is, what are you doing here? Marilla reached for her handbag and he his billfold, searching for the ticket that would provide the answer. It says right here, cabin 24, he said. Marilla shook her ticket, and it says right here, cabin 23. They stared at each other, confident each was right, until a knock at the cabin door rattled them both. Miss Cuthbert, do you need assistance with your baggage? Realizing his error, the man opened the door and, before Marilla could say a word, dragged his bags out into the hallway. My apologies, sir. I seem to have made a mistake. Shocked at finding a man stepping from the room, the steward poked his head around the corner and stared at Marilla. Miss Cuthbert, is this gentleman bothering you? No, not at all. As he said, there's been a mistake. I believe his room is next door. Marilla picked up the man's hat, passed it through the door, and closed it behind her. A snicker, unbidden and rare, forced its way through. She covered her face and bent forward. When she stood, the sound of laughter filled the room. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, and though guilty for its presence at a time so full of grief, she rejoiced at the sound of the lifting of her heart. The following morning, lulled by the waves throughout the night and feeling content inside her bunk, Marilla hugged the blankets to her chest and thought of all that lay ahead. The man next door, Mr. Sullivan, a recent widow, unused to traveling without his wife, had apologized profusely for his intrusion. In the passenger lounge later that evening, they shared a pot of tea, then bade each other good night. She could still hear the sound of his laughter and the comfort in his words. He leaned across the table soon after they were seated and said, please believe me when I say I do miss my wife. but I am so relieved she was not here to witness the sight of me stumbling backwards through your cabin door. Marilla, surprised by the note of humor in his voice, tried not to smile. She would surely have died all over again, he said, then threw back his head and laughed, surprising those who had gathered for a quiet evening tea. He pulled a hanky from his pocket and wiped his eyes, and only then did Marilla see the sorrow the memory had evoked. Please don't think me heartless, but if she were here, my Rosie, she would have laughed with me. We shared everything, you see. That's what I missed the most. He stopped and took a deep breath. I loved her very much. He looked embarrassed then, the exposure of his pain to a stranger, unheard of under normal circumstances, deepening the color beneath his collar. His hands trembled as he reached for his cup. Marilla understood his pain and felt her own grief fill her chest. I too lost someone I loved very much, and never imagined it was even possible to laugh again when for just a moment I could forget. But I did, so I thank you for that. Mr. Sullivan leaned in and spoke words Marilla would never forget. Remember, Miss Cuthbert, love is not taken to the grave along with those we love. It lives on in each of us. Don't ever stop living the life you've been given. And like my Rosie, don't ever stop seeing the joy. The laughter had been a gift, a reminder that even as she grieved, her heart would mend. She would carry her burden of loss as others do, but life was for the living, he told her. She was young and she'd survive. Amid the loss and sadness, guilt and sorrow, there was, for the first time in a long time, a feeling of hope. So that was the scene of her going back to Prince Edward Island from being in Halifax. So how am I doing for time? Jane, I will continue. I have one more small section to read, and then I'm going to hand it back to Jane for lots of questions. So this one here is 20 years later, and Marilla's about to turn 40. And I love this scene. The two people in it are her friend, Rachel, her best friend, and her brother, Matthew, is in this as well. And the man that's referred to, John Blythe, was referred to in that first chapter as the man she was supposed to marry. Out of the corner of her eye, through the open window, Marilla could see a skirt flapping across the field and peered closer. Rachel? Running? It couldn't be. Though her oldest daughter was the spit of her mother, Rachel's heft left no doubt as to who it was. Now, what in the name of heavens would she be running for or from? Marilla muttered as she made her way downstairs. The back door opened just as Marilla reached the kitchen. Rachel stumbled in and made her way to the table where she sat huffing and holding her chest. Good heavens, Rachel, what is this all about? Has something happened to Thomas? The children? Rachel shook her head and held up a hand. When she'd sufficiently got hold of herself, she started. You will not believe this, Marilla. You will not believe what I just heard. Always one for gossip, Rachel didn't miss much of the goings-on in Avonlea. Marilla rolled her eyes and headed to the pantry for water. She passed Rachel a glass and took the seat beside her. No, I probably won't, but you might as well tell me anyway. I can't believe you'd get yourself all upset over something you heard, and running no less. Marilla smoothed out her apron and drew on what little patience she had left for idle gossip. Go on then, what did you hear? Rachel's eyes went wide. John Blythe is coming home. Marilla, shocked at hearing his name, sat motionless for so long that Rachel was not the only one who had to catch her breath. Coming home after all these years? Surely not. Where did you hear this? Lloyd down at the general store told Clarence, and Clarence told Thomas. Rachel leaned toward Marilla and lowered her voice. Apparently he's coming back to open up the old homestead. Imagine, coming back to Avonlea, a place he said he would never, ever set foot in again. Do you remember that, Marilla? Of course I remember. Marilla rose quickly, reached for the kettle, and set it to boil. She stood at the stove, lost in thought. The year her mother had humiliated him with her plan. Has he been up in Toronto all this time? Apparently, Rachel said, and he's done well for himself, so they say. Now, I'm only asking because I'm curious. Marilla shook a finger at Rachel as she continued. Don't make something out of nothing. She reached for the teapot and cups on the sideboard and placed them on the table. But did they happen to say if he ever married? The Rachel who jumped up from the table was not the mother of 11 children, The look on her face took Marilla back to when they were girls. And when she grabbed her hand and started twirling on her circle, Marilla struggled not to laugh. Oh, for goodness sake, Rachel, I knew it. I knew you'd go on. Oh, but it's so romantic, Rachel said, clasping her hands together. After all this time, he's come back and the two of you. What foolishness, Marilla said, stopping Rachel mid-sentence. And the two of us what? Pick up from the last time I saw him? You always were a bit for Rachel. I don't mind saying, but this? Matthew stepped into the kitchen just then and stared at Marilla, who looked a bit flushed. Afternoon, Rachel. Saw someone running toward the house. Was that you? Yes, it was me. Why? She said in response to Matthew's smirk. You never saw a woman run across a field before? Well, now it's been a while. What's happened? Marilla removed the whistling kettle from the stove and walked to the table. Nothing has happened, she said, pouring the water into the pot. She stared at Rachel, and nothing will. Rachel, undeterred, started to make plans. He arrives next Friday. Thomas is picking him up at the ferry, and he'll be in church on Sunday. No doubt, so you can see him then. I'm picking him up, Matthew said, surprising them both. Thomas already asked me. Marilla's words were sharp as she faced Matthew. You knew about this, about John, and never said a word? Thought it best not to, I suppose. Right, Marilla said, catching herself. Well, it makes no difference one way or the other. Marilla said, now sit, the two of you, tea's steeped. They sat around the table, pouring and stirring, adding sugar and milk, Rachel trying her best to tamp down her excitement, while Matthew sat building up the nerve to speak. Holding his teacup in his weathered hand, Matthew found his sister's eyes across the table. Some folks thinking he might be coming back for you, Marilla. Marilla, so stunned to hear Matthew utter what Rachel had just been saying, coughed and spluttered, sending a spray of tea across the table. Rachel snorted and Matthew let out a hoot of laughter. Marilla, unable to speak at first, finally joined them, and the sound of their laughter rolled back the years until they were young again, back before they knew what life had in store. The sound released a memory held within Marilla's heart of a time long ago, a time before William, when John had been the first boy she'd ever kissed. What foolishness, she scoffed. Though a feeling of something like hope flickered, she reached up and straightened her hair, while the thought of dresses for the second time that day occupied her thought. So there's just a little bit of an introduction to Marilla, a little teaser of things to come. I really do all hope that you enjoy reading the book. So now, Jane is going to be asking some questions about the book. And then after, like Kate had said, there will be questions from the participants.
That was wonderful, Louise. And I certainly enjoyed reading my copy. And it was nice to hear you bring those voices to life. And I have to get you to sign my copy the next time we're together. Okay. So yes, I do have a few questions for you. And the first one, I know you've been asked this one before in other interviews, but I thought this is a good forum to discuss it again. So when you decided to write this novel, were you concerned that some Anne of Green Gables, and I'll do this, purists would take issue with the backstory you had imagined for Marilla?
Yes. I did, Jane, honestly. I was worried that my take on the story would not be appreciated by everybody. I've got notes here, you guys, so I'm just going to refer to them. But honestly, all families have secrets, and that's all this is. It's the revealing of a truth that had gone with Marilla to the grave. Nobody knew. And it was Marilla, the character herself, who gave me this story. And it felt like a huge responsibility that I was going to get to write this, you know? And my responsibility to the character of Marilla is to get that story to readers, to people.
And I love what I listened to your interview with Matt Rainey, CBC Radio and PEI this morning. And I love what you had said too about, you know, you felt that there are lots of other writers who could have written this story. Maybe this is your first novel. But you felt like Marilla was speaking to you, and you were Marilla's vessel to get her story out.
She chose me. She really did. And I didn't believe that at first. I kept thinking, oh, there's so many better writers here in Atlantic Canada. But she chose me, and I'm just really, I'm happy. I'm really proud of that.
That gave me goosebumps. All right. Second question. So this is a work of historical fiction. Your novel is set in rural 19th century Prince Edward Island. How did you conduct your research? So the details like carrying water in a pail or from a spring back to the pantry in the house to make tea would be historically accurate.
This is funny. This is funny. I mean, I did research. I researched Prince Edward Island during the mid-1800s. I wanted to know things like agriculture and clothing and foods and industry and all of those kinds of things. But honestly, mid-1800s Prince Edward Island was not much different than 1950s small communities in Nova Scotia. I mean, my family's from a community in Owl's Head. And certainly going to the well to get water, going to the spring to get water, you know, hanging out laundry, cooking on a wood stove, no electricity, no indoor plumbing. I mean, there were lots of things that were in that 100 years hadn't changed a lot. So I drew on a lot of those stories that I heard my mom and my dad talk about, who certainly grew up in that community, and my older brothers and sisters who you know, spent their early years in Owl's Head before we moved to Halifax. So I just drew on all of those stories, and then just in doing the research, really coming up with information that I could put in the story that made it really, really relevant.
And it did, and authentic as well.
Authentic.
So I want to ask you about favorite characters. First, I want to tell you that in the Anne of Green Gables novels, my favorite character is Rachel Lynde. And she does make an appearance in yours, kind of a character actress, if you will. And she's still one of my favorite characters because I like characters who stir the pot. I mean, she's good-hearted, but as one of your readings illustrated, she's also a gossip. Besides Marilla, do you have a favorite character? And if so, why?
I do. One of my favorite characters in the story is the character Etta Byers. And Etta, as people who read the story know, she's the companion for Marilla's Aunt Martha. And as a character, she's modeled after my own biological grandmother, who was born in 1896, and in 1910 signed over for adoption my own father to a couple who raised him as their own. So I always, when the character came to me, my belief was that because she had gone through what she had gone through as this young woman, which would have been really heartbreaking at the time, I believe that she went on to help other women who had experienced the same thing. And like a lot of women, and my story talks about that, a lot of women in communities, they just supported each other through some of those really tough times and tough decisions. And so I really came to really love her in the story and felt a connection to a biological mother, a grandmother that I really don't know much about at all. But for me, I felt like I came to know her through that.
Mm-hmm. She was a very grounded character, I know. Yeah. Speaking of tough times, good segue to my next question. There is a lot of heartbreak and loss throughout your novel. Were you worried there was too much, or did monumental personal losses reflect that era?
I did. I worried about it, partly because as I was reading it around my writers groups, because I belong to writers groups and be reading this for feedback, they would always once in a while say, can't you put in there something kind of light and funny or whatever? But it's not that kind of story, right? And I remember asking Whitney about it when we met, and Whitney thought, no, it's appropriate for the story that we're telling. And the truth of it is, Jane, I really did I guess, present things in a much nicer way than they actually were. I mean, we were talking the mid-1800s, you know, the challenges for families, people died in accidents and illness. I mean, there's no antibiotics, there's no women dying in childbirth and babies dying soon after they're born. Those were commonplace, everyday sorts of things that happen in communities, and they just dealt with it and moved on and kept going. So life was tough. Remember, you know, there's no electricity, there's no central heating, there's outside toilets. So, you know, it's a rough life. And I tried to add a little bit more sentiment that maybe people would have had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so it is a very hard time. And this story is challenging, but it's not unlike a lot of other stories of women who had lived in small communities around the Atlantic provinces. I'm sure everybody's got a story.
Mm-hmm. And these were, supportive, strong women. And I know that was something you really wanted to convey, was women helping women.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like readers to know about this book that you haven't revealed yet?
One of the people that I haven't talked about much, and nobody's really asked me about, is the character of Matthew, which is Marilla's brother. And he's such a quiet man. I mean, I think people just assumed he was a loner. He's shy. He's a social kind of outcast. He was very uncomfortable around girls and women. And the character that I wrote about really suffered from agoraphobia, not a word that existed in the mid-1800s at all, but I tried to write it in a way to explain how that came to be. I mean, he had lost the affection and love of his mother early on in his life, and then suffered the rest of his life surrounded by her bitterness. So his ability, I mean, and he met and fell in love with somebody, but he could never marry her because the social obligations of just going to Charlottetown and getting married and meeting family, it overwhelmed him. He couldn't go any further than the little town of Avonlea. And so I really was so happy to show people the side of Matthew that existed before we see him later on.
Mm-hmm. I've always had a soft spot for Matthew, and after reading your novel, I still do.
Yeah.
Now, I know you're working on another novel. Can you tell us what that's about?
Yeah, it's out there now. I'm talking about it. So I'm going to read it as I wrote it. It's a story of a woman raised in Boston who comes to Halifax in 1946 and sees a photo of a headstone that has her name and date of birth on it. It also contains the names of two people listed as her parents, as well as the date of her death, which happened on the day of the Halifax explosion, December 6, 1917. So the working title is called Out of the Ashes, and it's primarily story of people who were impacted by that event. The story starts in Boston with this young woman coming to visit Halifax. And so we get her background of her story, and then she comes to Halifax. So right now I'm in the process of just really, reworking that manuscript, getting it ready so that if things go well, I'll be able to submit it and send it out there and see if this story can also land in the hands of readers. I know, speaking of my sisters, hello sisters, they all read that first manuscript and they all loved the story. I mean, even in this unedited, unfinished, polished form, they love the story. And so I really am determined that I will get that story out there.
So more historical fiction coming from you.
Exactly, historical fiction.
So that's a genre you really feel comfortable with, and is that something you enjoy reading yourself?
I do, absolutely. I know when Genevieve and I were talking, and she was saying, because I was saying about, the worry of, are there too many stories about the Halifax explosion? And she said, well, look at all the stories that are coming out about the Second World War. We still haven't tired of those. Some beautiful stories. So different imaginings, different ways, different view of the same event.
And different readers too.
Readers, that's right.
Yeah. Well, those were my questions, Louise, for you. So I think it's time for our audience members to put in, I'm looking at the public chat. So I think you can put if you have questions for Louise, put them in the public chat. I think there's a Q&A button down there too, but I think our preference is just to put them in the chat, and then I can, I see one. I can read them out. From Scott at Halifax Public Libraries. In your mind, what does young Marilla look like? Color of hair, facial features, height?
Marilla is a little bit taller than what most women would have been. So she came, she was taller. She had sort of brown hair. She had blue eyes. I forget now those specifics, but she was very, at certainly a younger age, she had, you know, very thin waist and delicate features but stood very tall and very statuesque. Similar to the book cover, I guess. Very statuesque.
Here's another question from Kate Watson. What books influenced you as a writer?
Aw. The reason why I do that is because one of my favorite writers and favorite people is Sherry Fitch. And I had read a book, I had read Sherry's book called Kiss the Joy as It Flies. And I loved that book. Again, about a woman, about being a strong woman, and Sherry herself being a wonderful, strong woman. I had read a lot of her material over the years, and she inspired me to write. I know this is going to sound bad when I say this, but this is what I say. I looked at her as being a woman my age. She, you know, she was married and she wrote these books. And I thought, well, if she can do it, maybe I can do it. Which doesn't make Sherry sound like a very great writer. But I mean, I just thought, gee, here's an ordinary person who can write this beautiful work. Maybe I can do the same thing. So she certainly had inspired me at the very beginning.
I don't see another question yet, but I always, oh, wait a second. Yes, there's a question. All right, from Dimitri.
Wow.
Congratulations, Louise. What was your favorite scene to write in your novel, if you could pick one?
I can. There is one scene where Marilla has found out about the death of somebody close to her, and she simply collapses, and she's kind of carried away to this couple's home where she has to kind of come to and she's asking, like, tell me it's not true. And just that sense of loss and how she felt laying in that bed. To me, that was just a powerful scene for me to write, and a powerful scene. I guess I'm hoping that people will read that and really feel her pain, was feeling her pain. So that was a scene that I like. There's, following that, her Etta comes to pick her up, to take her home. And I mean, Etta just is there for her. And I love that she had been there for her and all of that. Anyway, that, Dimitri, long story short, that's one of my favorite scenes.
I always prefer the long story to the short story. And we've got more questions coming, just rapid fire here. So, I like this question. Personally, I'll get to the question in a second. I would like for you to write Rachel Lynde's story. However, that's not for me to decide. The question is, do you think you will ever write Matthew's story?
That's a really good question. I never thought of that. And so I guess I would say, if there's a lot of people asking, maybe. But I think, again, it would have to be inspired by Matthew wanting to tell his story. That's how I feel about the character. I think that it would have to be sort of sitting there and saying, okay, I want to tell the story. And I don't feel that yet. Okay.
And that was from an attendee named Corinne. Another question is from Wilma Stewart White. Why does PEI have such a special place in your heart?
Wow. I love PEI. I really do. I mean, I talk about how I had gone there. I was in my mid-20s, like 24, 25, and I took my two little boys, the Sean, who's now watching from out west, and we watched the play, Anne of Green Gables. And I mean, that's when I fell in love with the story. And that's when I really loved Marilla. And since then, I mean, I just go back to visit. My husband and I actually got engaged over there. You know, it has a very special place in my heart. I love it over there. Staying at any of the, I've gone to the Charlottetown Festival. I've gone to see all the different tributes to people, you know, and so, yeah, really enjoy that. My sister Maureen and I have certainly gone over together and enjoyed like an overnight lobster dinner. And I love PEI. Yeah.
All right. Well, this is a three-tier question from Stella Shepherd. So there are three questions. What inspired you to write this book, which I think you've touched on already? Have you read all of the Anne series? And is there an introduction to the adoption of Anne in the novel? So maybe we'll just deal with the last two. Have you read all of the Anne series?
I haven't. I honestly haven't. I remember the Marilla Before Anne book in school, at home. I remember it, but I didn't do the rest of the series. I mean, by the time I was 13, 14, I was reading full novels, full adult novels. So I didn't spend a lot of time in young adult books or books for young girls. So I didn't. What was that second part?
The second part was, is there an introduction to the adoption of Anne in the novel?
No.
Easy, good. Short answer, because we have a message from Sean Scallion.
Yes.
Jack, your grandson, says, hi and congratulations, Nanny.
Oh, bless you, Jack. Thank you. My book is dedicated to Jack. This book has a dedication. If I could just read that, just sort of interrupt you, Jane, excuse me. This book is dedicated to my grandson, Jack Scallion of Baker Creek, BC, whose heritage, like Anne's, is deeply rooted in the soil of East Coast Canada. I mean, Jack's mother's heritage is from the Acadian community in New Brunswick, and then his dad from here in Nova Scotia. So I always feel like he does have some roots right here.
That's great. All right, a couple more. Liz Ferrand, I hope I pronounced that right, says that she loved Aunt Martha and Etta, that storyline. What was your inspiration in including that?
Wow, Lauren, oh, so nice that you're there. That warms my heart. It evolved. All I can say is it evolved. I didn't start writing the story with that in mind. The two characters presented themselves, and their story and their relationship developed as I wrote it, as natural as could be. And when it did develop, I had to go back to the beginning and adjust a few things that would at least let the reader know that it was developing. So yeah, it ended up being a beautiful relationship between these two women, which in the late 1800s certainly had been referred to as the Boston marriage, which is when two women, professional women without family and children, could live together, you know, in the same home, and they shared a life together in that way. So I describe it that same way.
That was a beautiful relationship. Cheryl Black asks, are you finished with Green Gables, or do you have other characters you want to explore? Like the person who asked about, are you going to tell Matthew's story? She says, I personally love the elderly lady that the girls want to stay with in Charlottetown. I'd love to hear about her youth. Lots of suggestions, Louise.
I know, lots of suggestions. I think one of the people, when I think about one of the people that I might like to explore is the woman that Matthew didn't marry, Violet. Violet's a really sweet character who only in there for a little bit. I kind of then, after I didn't write any more about her because it's not about her, thought afterwards, oh, who did she marry? What was her life like? What happened? You know, there's a part of me that sort of wants to talk about that story, but whether that happens or not, I don't know. Did I answer that?
I think you did. And also, I mean, you're in the thick of another novel right now. So, I mean, you one can only write so much at at one time.
We know that. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. From Susan, we don't have another question, but Susan Foy says, I can't wait to read it. Probably Marilla Before Anne. I was raised in PEI and loved Anne. I think it would be awesome to do a story on each of them. You've got a series right, lining up ahead of you, Louise.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
And these are, I know some of these attendees, because this is a library event, are avid readers. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. As is my grandson, Jack. He's a wonderful reader. And he and my son, Sean, I think just are in the middle of, or maybe have finished. They went back and read the Anne of Green Gables story. So they'd be prepared for this.
Nice. Scott from Halifax Public Libraries has another question. Does Marilla have a middle name? If not, I wonder what name you would give her.
Her middle name was Anne.
It is, isn't it? That's with an E.
It is. Yeah, she's Marilla Anne.
And you
her mother, in one scene, her mother's mad at her, and like every mother does, you do the whole name, Marilla Anne Cuthbert. Yeah.
I love this question. This is also more. Can you see it, Louise?
Yeah. How many pots of tea were brewed during the writing of the novel? What is your teacher? My husband's in the other room over there listening to this. So, Trifon, did you hear that? It's the same thing. And he was reading it and editing it for me. He goes, everybody's having tea all the time. How many pots of tea were brewed? And it does seem like that, but honestly, when we all get together, aren't we making coffee or tea for each other? That seems to be what happens. So yeah, lots of pots of tea, Lauren. And my tea of choice is probably Tetley or Red Rose.
Tetley. Milk in first or second, or no milk at all?
Milk, either way, milk in first or after, no sugar.
No sugar. All right. My grandmother always said milk in first, so I put my milk in first.
Okay. My sister Jean, who lives in Musquodoboit Harbor. Hi, Jean, if you're on there. She always makes a brewed pot. I mean, I tend to put a tea bag in the cup, and she makes a brewed pot of tea and pours it. I always find that the best tea.
We always did a pot as well. And my husband does, you know, as you do, puts the bag in the cup. In the
yeah, not as nice.
All right. Oh. Can you tell us about the cover of your book? Maybe that's Scott again. Maybe he means how the design, you know, how the design came to be. Did you have any input into it?
I did, thankfully, and Whitney was wonderful in consulting me on it. She sent me a few pictures, and I sent her a few pictures, and we finally, she found this. And as soon as I saw it, the picture up close is the woman, Marilla, who is surrounded by rose vines that are full of thorns. And it just, I thought, oh yeah, you know, the prickling of the thorns in life. And I thought it was so beautiful. And I just like the silhouette. And I like her, the pose that she has. And just the fact that it's really not, there's no picture of Green Gables. There's no picture of Prince Edward Island. This is a story about Marilla. And I like that it was that way.
And can we also, because I have a little insider insight here, and this is in keeping with the attention you paid to detail. I know you told me a story about, I think originally, this image, there were puffed sleeves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the first picture that Whitney sent me, I thought, oh no, we can't use that. It had puffed sleeves, which the character Marilla, as we know, thought that was all kind of frivolous and you know, wasteful and whatever. So I thought, well, that's out of it. We can't even decide on that because there's no way.
Yeah, I know. Anne in I don't know if it was Anne of Green Gables, the first one, but I think Anne wanted a dress. All she wanted was that dress with puffed sleeves.
Puffed sleeves. Oh yeah. There's a scene where Matthew goes in and gets it. Yeah,
that's
puffed
right.
sleeves. So I knew that one had to go.
Yeah. Yeah, so no puff sleeves here. No, not for Marilla.
For the conference center. Oh, Joyce, you would say that, wouldn't you? Suggest the next project to be a stage version for Confederation Center. Yes, wouldn't that be wonderful?
Or a TV, I think a TV movie, like the Anne of Green Gables books. I think they were, I don't know if it was a movie or a TV series, but I watched whatever it was, I watched them.
I noticed it's getting a bit darker, Jane. I'm just going to move the light.
Okay.
Better? A little better.
A little better. So what is ahead? So we're June now. I think all of our launches, like mine ended up coming out a month earlier. I think yours is a little than planned. Yours is a little later. So what is ahead for you in terms of promotions for this book? You know, we don't know when we're going to be able to do signings again.
Right.
Bookstores. So, yeah. Do you know what what next steps are?
The only thing I have coming up is on Friday morning. I am going to be having an interview with Amanda Debison from CTV. So she contacted me today, and so we'll be doing 7:45 in the morning. I have to get up early, and then we will have I guess an on-air kind of video session where she'll ask me some questions. So I'm thrilled about that, as are all my sisters and family, that I'm going to be on CTV. They've been waiting for that.
That's exciting.
So that's really all I have. And I think as maybe Kate had talked about earlier with us, is that there may be something happening in August. If we're all able to gather at some level, there may be some kind of an event take place at the Nimbus Publishing warehouse itself up on Strawberry Hill, where we as authors may get to do some readings and maybe invite some friends to that. So there's still a chance that we could kind of have a get together in person.
I think so. Oh, here's a good question. This is a good question, actually. I don't know the answer to this one. Will there be an audiobook?
I don't know that. I asked if I could do it. I said, I'd like to do that myself and read it. But as it was explained to me that if that's going to be done, they would simply, through the Canadian Actors Union, that they would hire an actress to do that. Right. And so I totally appreciate that. But I would like an audio one, because there are people certainly, and my sister who's no longer with us, had worked for the Canadian Institute of the Blind. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people certainly can't read the book, and it might not be transcribed into Braille, but if they could hear it, that would be wonderful.
And I know audiobooks are really popular. I mean, people say, oh, I read them when I'm walking to work or gardening or driving to work. So yeah. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. If you had to choose an actress, now this is probably a tough question. If you had to choose an actress to narrate your audiobook, who would it be?
To narrate the book?
Mm-hmm.
I probably want it to be someone from the East Coast, who would have that twang and language and you know what, I can't.
It's hard. That's a hard one, isn't it? What about age?
Like a Bette McDonald. Bette McDonald. Yeah. So like a Bette McDonald, she's got, she could inflect the humor into it. She could be serious. I can't think.
Tom, you can think on it. Make a list.
Think on it. Okay, I'll think on it.
You can think on it. Someone suggested Mary Collin Chisholm. She's a theater actress, I think, primarily. Yeah. Deb Allen would be a great reader from Clary Croft. Who's Deb Allen? Oh,
Deb Allen. Okay. Heather Rankin.
Yeah, it would depend on what age, what age of Marilla you would want. Maybe you could have different actresses for different ages.
Yeah, because I think the voice would maybe change a little bit, although not much.
Yeah.
Something to look forward to. You're losing me.
We're losing you? I can still.
Well, just losing me to the dark. I feel like I'm dark.
Oh, I know. Let's see. So any other questions? Or is there anything else? I know I asked you, is there anything else you want to reveal? And you're probably going to be telling these stories over and over the more media you get. But what do you hope readers take away or feel when they finish that last page and they say, wow, I'm done. That was quite a story.
Wow. I want them to feel that full circle moment in life, that full circle. I think that as a woman of my age, I can relate to that. And my sons have lived away for a long time. They've lived out in BC, and I've spent a lot of years wanting in my heart to bring them home. I know they're not coming, but to bring them home. It's that feeling of that full circle of coming home is a wonderful feeling. And I hope people really, when they get to that, really understand the fullness of what that is.
Mm-hmm. We have a few more minutes, Louise, and I see there's another question there, so I'm going to read it. Will there be an American release? And if yes, is the cover going to be different?
There is going to be an American release. There is a distributor in the States who will be distributing the book, but I'm not aware of any different cover. I've never been shown anything different, so I'm assuming it's going to be the same.
I know, I think for other books, when they go to different countries, they do often change the cover. Sometimes a different language too, a country with a different language, they change the title as well. So, but I think for the States, yeah.
It would definitely stay as just Marilla Before Anne,
Yeah.
I would think.
That's a
Yep,
good
haven't
question.
heard.
Mm-hmm.
Gee. Is the cover different? What was the other one, Ted? Yeah. Great questions, you guys. Just great. And it's lovely to see so many of you. I can see all of your names, so I can't see your faces. I can see all the names of people who are attending. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of those who did take the time to really, log into this and watch. It's, as a first-time author, it's so, I feel like I'm part of I found my tribe, I found my people, my writers, the people who love to read. I'm with people who really, I guess for me, are kindred spirits. I guess I could say that. So yeah, I thank you all for participating in this.
I have one more question in the 7 minutes that we have left, because we've talked a lot about, pretty much exclusively about your book, but I know you and I have very different processes. I'm more like Leslie Crew. We don't join writing groups. I've done one fiction workshop and one humor workshop. That's it. But your writing group, I know, is integral to your creative process. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and give a shout out.
Absolutely. If there are any of my writer friends from Tarpon Springs, Florida, I found that group very early on, and they met every Wednesday, and everybody read something and got critiqued. And so that's how my process started. I wrote a chapter every week just so I'd have something to read. So I would come home, I would write down their comments and set that aside, start the next chapter, go and read it. So I wrote, 40 chapters in 40 weeks is what I say. And each chapter, if you read it out loud, is about 10 minutes, because that's all I was allowed to read at the group. So all my chapters ended up being just enough within that 10 minutes that you finish it up. So yeah, a writing group for me is so important. I love to read my work out loud. I like to hear it back. I like feedback. I also have a writer's group here in Halifax at the Open Book Cafe, a group of women that I met when we attended the Sherbrooke Village Writers Camp, and Clary Croft was there as well. And a group of women, we formed a group called Words and Whimsy. And so now we meet every Wednesday morning at Open Book, now that it's open, and we critique our work. Jean Hillman is going to have her own book, children's book, coming out this fall. Melanie Mosier has, she's published books as well. We have Trish Jodry. Back to Jean for a minute. Jean writes beautiful poetry. Trish Jodry, she writes gorgeous articles for magazines about travel, and she's working on a memoir of her life when she lived in India. So I'm surrounded by these women who have these wonderful stories and lots of experience and lots to contribute. So I just feel really blessed. And writing is isolating enough, and I'm just too much of a people person. I need to get together and talk.
Yeah, and be a great motivator as well. Like you said, you knew you had to have something to read at that next writers group meeting. So, well, I guess I have to write something. Yeah.
That's right. I never show up without something to read, ever.
Yeah. And I know you have said that once you retired and you started writing, you treated it like a job. So maybe you just tell everyone how you spent your days.
Yeah, I say that because I worked for government for a lot of years. That's very structured. Lunch at noon time, coffee break morning, afternoon. So I just took that work schedule and just sat at the computer, and I worked basically in the morning, had lunch, a little bit in the afternoon, worked all during the week and took the weekends off, just like I was working. And I treated it and I worked around that. And people say, oh, you're so disciplined. And it might have been disciplined to set it up, but once it's set up in place, I just simply sat at the computer starting at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and wrote to lunchtime and then continued on. I didn't find it difficult. There were days when I would sit down with that blank piece of paper, chapter 13, and I'd go, and sometimes I'd go, well, I don't know what's going to happen next. What in the name of God's going to happen? I have no clue. And then I'd remind myself, I'd say, okay, you're a writer. Dentists don't show up at the dentist office someday and say, oh my God, I forget how to do a filler. I mean, they're a dentist. They do what they do. I'm a writer. I have to trust. I have to sit down, get back into that last scene with the characters, find out where they are and where they're going next, and then I just follow them. That's all. That's what I did.
You never had a writer's block, because I know I took 3 months off when I was writing Fishnets and Fantasies, my second novel. I hit a wall, and I thought, I don't know what comes next, and I remember Sarah Mayan, I had taken a fiction workshop with her, and she said, I don't believe in writer's block. She said, there comes a time when your characters stop talking to you. And when that happens, go out and live your life. Go out and have some fun. Don't sit there and try and force it. So I remembered that. And I went, you know what? I'm going to take the summer off. It was like 30 degrees in the office. I'm upstairs in my office. I had to take the AC unit out of the window so it wouldn't show up on the video. But I just thought, I'm going to take the summer off. But like you, I'm very disciplined as well and have a similar schedule. And I thought, September is back to school. Well, when the kids go back to school, I'm going to sit down and start writing again. And that's what I did. And that break was good. But so that didn't happen to you. You were, wow, you're lucky.
I wrote a chapter a week for, I think Marilla's, there's 39 chapters in this book. And my first manuscript had 40. And so, no, I just did them week after week. I never had a moment where I didn't know, I mightn't have known what was going to happen next. But as soon as I got into the scene, the characters just took me. And I just followed them. And I can remember just a funny story. My sister, Corrine, God love her, she listened to everything. I mean, I'd call her and say, have you got a minute? Listen to this. And I remember calling her one time and saying, Corrine, a character just showed up. She just showed up. I might have to, I think I might have to kill her. and I don't know how to do that. And she said, well, you wrote her in, just write her out. I said, I can't, she's there. And I even tried to change her name and I couldn't. I wanted to call this character Rita. No way. She was Vera, and Vera showed up even as I was writing, and I went, what? Where did she come from? So writing is this process of surprises with characters. And she was integral part of that story. You just write. These characters come and you just live with them and write their story. It's really about their story.
Well, and this was Marilla's story. I think, I mean, it's 8 o'clock. I don't see any more questions, but I think that's probably a good spot to end on. I mean, it's quite a story.
It is. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Louise. I could have listened to you read all night. Thank you so much. We were so happy to be a part of your book launch tonight. Thank you, Jane. Thank you to Nimbus Publishing, in particular, Kate, and to all of you at home. Thank you for watching our virtual program. Yes, good night and enjoy your evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.